So I want to talk about something today that's kind of a follow-up of a topic that's been increasingly important in the era of government in which we currently find ourselves, which is activism and this sort of feeling of helplessness that many of us understandably have. What can we actually do to affect change and to get the government? And it's really kind of a partnership between government and industry to listen to us, to just listen to people. And a lot of our viewers and listeners write in, and there's a theme to those emails, which is signing petitions doesn't really work. Voting is important. Calling our elected officials matters. But what else can we actually do to protest and to activate and to try to get change to take place in a way that would actually be good for the general public and the population? And there's a number of interesting works, papers, books on this topic that I've recently been looking at. And to remind you of where we kind of left this conversation before, the argument that we've been working with, or that I've been working with anyway, is that various forms of nonviolent resistance, I believe, in the long term, are more effective than violence. We're more likely to win agreement and be able to engage in negotiation with governments and industry when we use nonviolent means of resistance than violent. Now, understandably, sometimes you are activating in opposition to actions by governments or industry that can be, even if not physically violent, politically violent, or violent in the detrimental impact that they have on people. And so I completely understand that in history, there have been times for violent resistance. But to kind of recap for our conversation, I believe that we are going to be more effective activists if we do the right type of nonviolent resistance. The two methods or tactics that I previously have talked about a bunch of times now are civil disobedience and general strikes. We've already talked about those before. The idea of using general strikes and civil disobedience to cripple large swaths of government and industry in a way that would be very difficult to ignore. It doesn't guarantee, and I apologize as I punch my mic because I'm starting to get wound up in anticipation of the rest of the story. It doesn't guarantee that the activism will have the results we necessarily want, but they are means that will be much more effective in getting a response than simply signing petitions online. But I have other ideas to talk to you about today. Now, full disclaimer, most people literally can't afford to do the stuff I'm about to tell you. Most people are at huge risk, put themselves at huge risk to your own finances, to the finances of your family, to your own existence as sort of a free person in society. But the idea is that with all of the tactics I'm about to tell you, to discuss with you, if everyone does it or a large number of people do it, you're less likely to be targeted as an individual for doing it, and it will very quickly cripple systems that society depends on, and it may get the negotiating powers to the table to really look at affecting change. So again, most people aren't willing to do this stuff. Right now, I'm mostly also not willing to do a lot of these things because of the risk that's associated with it. But it's good to know that there are more things you can do other than write your elected officials and show up at a rally and sign petitions online and vote. If the system works poorly enough, more and more people will be willing to take it to the next level nonviolently. And some examples include strategic defaulting. Okay, strategic defaulting is when a borrower makes a decision to stop making their payments. Mostly we're talking about mortgages when we talk about strategic defaulting. Economists consider that a concerted strategic defaulting effort in the mortgage industry would collapse the banking industry unless there were massive government bailouts, and you would very quickly get both the financial industry, which is responsible for many of the problems we're dealing with, and the government to say, we've got to do something, and it can't just be starting to ding the credit reports of all these people. If enough people do it, okay, that's the key thing. Class action lawsuits can be used as activism if you have enough activist lawyers willing to file them. Class action lawsuits against industry for their destruction of public resources, maltreatment of public individuals and customers. Class action lawsuits can be used en masse to cripple both companies and the court system, but you need a concerted effort to actually do it. Mass rallies in urban areas, but to such a concerted degree that the cities are effectively shut down. If this happens in one place, sort of, authorities can kind of keep the system moving. If the largest 20 cities in the United States are flooded with people for mass rallies, everything from public transit to business gets overwhelmed. People can't go to work. Don't have to be violent, but we've got to be there rallying. You will very quickly see that the system cannot simply ignore that. Stopping all non-necessary financial consumption. This means no new iPhone unless yours literally doesn't work anymore. No eating out. You buy the minimum groceries necessary. This will have a massive impact on the economy right away. Withholding scheduled payments beyond mortgages. We talked about strategic defaults on mortgages. This could be withholding rent payments, utility payments, general fiscal noncompliance. Stop paying speeding tickets and property taxes. And again, if one person does it, if a few people do it, they just get penalized for it. If enough people do it, this stuff will cripple the systems that are in charge of the financial system and that are dependent on those payments coming in. Now, what's important to understand here, Pat, is that in the short term, a lot of these types of activism can actually hurt people who are doing the activism. It can hurt workers via layoffs. It can hurt small businesses. But eventually, if coordinated in large quantities, these are types of protests that will force the government and industry to act. Will it work? Not necessarily, but my point here is it's good to know that you can do more than just vote, sign petitions, and call your elected officials.
Not too long ago, I read Nelson Mandela's memoir, A Long Walk to Freedom, and he talked about the 4 types of violent activism. Those included everything from sabotage to guerrilla warfare to terrorism and all the way to outright revolution. Now, I would never advocate for those last 3, and certainly apartheid South Africa is far different than what we have here in Trump's America today. But sabotage, that's an interesting one because that has to do with just tearing down government property, obstructing roadways, vandalism. I guess you could say it's violent, but it's not violent against particular people. Is that something, not certainly that you would endorse, but that you would put on the table as something that could be effective, that could work?
Well, the thing is that the tactics you listed, some I think would be over the line and are clearly violent, and some would sort of be on this side of the line. So I think we'd have to sort of evaluate exactly which tactic we're talking about. Destruction of government property would be one thing. Peaceful obstruction of roadways, I think, is a different one. But you're thinking along the lines of how do we categorize these different types of activism? And my message to you here is that there are other tactics available. If and when it's time to use them is sort of a gray area that we can kind of continue having a conversation about.